Jason. This is Chicago Mastering Service. We have to figure out the width of the groove we can cut given the bass pitch that we're going to work with. So the further apart you set a bass pitch without music playing, which is when this needle settles and it tells you, in this case, that our bass pitch is 225 lines per inch. So if you just ran this with no music, it would put 225 lines per inch on the record. And given that, you can make the pitch, or you can make rather the width of the cut a width that will approximately butt the grooves together for that given pitch. The first thing we have to do basically is figure out the parameters of a lacquer cut. Like you have to look at how long the cut is and then think about how loud you can cut it, which basically changes how far apart the grooves are going to be, as well as the dynamic range of the material does that. So this is a meter that gives you lines per inch, which this pitch computer over here basically varies the spacing of the pitch, which is the distance between each groove. It's the speed at which the whole carriage here is moving towards the center of the record as it cuts. So when you play music, you can watch this meter, and it basically sort of functions as a volume meter in that the louder the musical passages, the more it moves in the way that would normally look like louder, but in this case it's actually indicating more space between each groove. So you're trying to figure out, like, playing this music the way it averages here dynamically, am I going to be able to fit that piece of music onto this record? So then I just cut a little bit of blank space, a little bit of silence, and just look at the spacing, set that on the scrap disc. I'll just find a little spot in between some cuts. To do that, we need the microscope on. So every time you drop the stylus, you have to check that you're picking up the little thread that it's cutting out of the record, out of the lacquer. And that's kind of one of the wild cards.
Oh, because if the thread...
Because if it just bunches up and doesn't go up this little suction tube, then it's just going to be a big mess and you blow your cut. So the very first thing you have to do is make sure that that's picking up properly. Once you get going with this machine, it does a pretty good job of not letting you screw things up, but starting it is always the part that's fraught with anxiety. We frequently clean this stylus with a little bit of acetone, which just gets any crud. Because it's heating, there's a little wire wrapped around this sapphire stylus that's actually heating it while it cuts to make it cut through the lacquer material easier. And so sometimes you just get a little crud on there, so generally clean it off a few times during the cut, every time it comes up. So now we're doing some super wacky electronica kind of stuff. The other part of cutting that can be tricky is high frequency information like vocal sibilants or really crazy things like that. So you have these high frequency limiters that are built into the lathe rack, which serve to sort of limit the speed of those transients that are high frequency in nature, because they'll just distort on playback if they're too extreme. So you can watch this thing kind of reacting pretty wacky to some of these heavy duty. We're going to make a pretty loud cut here, so we need to have this thing taking care of some business so that we get a distortion-free playback. There are certain instruments that can be more difficult to cut, which is especially stuff like percussive instruments like bells and chimes and things of that nature. Because they're basically like a pure transient. They're so high frequency that it's like if you're thinking of a groove that's going along, and then some transient is so high frequency that it's just like it's like a dead end to the needle, basically. Like when it takes off in a direction that isn't anything like straight, the needle just comes up on that at 33 RPM or 45 RPM, and sort of it's like the equivalent of driving into a brick wall, more or less. So what it will do if those aren't managed is it'll just skip up out of the groove. And that's what you hear is distortion. It just kind of pops along the top of the grooves until it kind of finds a place it can drop back in. So what we're trying to do is make those just not severe enough for the needle to track it accurately. And that's really one of the only things that you have to kind of compromise on with vinyl cutting versus like digital. I mean, you can cut really terribly compressed and limited digital material all day long, but it's just the high frequency stuff. Like if there's anything that's real fuzzy, high frequency distortion, it just doesn't translate that well to vinyl. So you end up rolling off some really high frequencies and using the high frequency limiter. But most of the time we have pretty good luck getting a cut to more or less sound exactly like the source material that we're working from.